can simply thinking about your own mortality, subtly but powerfully reshape how you perceive someone as controversial as Edward Snowden?
Hmm.
What psychological forces even determine who we label a hero?
That's a really profound question, isn't it? And it's exactly where we're diving today.
Okay.
We're unpacking a specific, um, quite fascinating psychology study. It was published in the International Journal of Psychological Studies,
Right.
and it explores this very surprising link, how being reminded of death, of all things, might actually make people more likely to see Edward Snowden as a hero.
Wow. Okay. So we have this one core source, this research paper. Our mission then is to really dig into its methods, its findings, and maybe most importantly, what it all implies.
Exactly. What it implies about how our deepest fears, maybe existential fears, might influence our views on figures who really challenge the status quo, like Snowden.
So maybe let's set the stage a bit first. Edward Snowden, based only on what the source material says.
Right, according to the paper, he's the former NSA contractor. Became globally known after revealing classified documents about government surveillance programs.
And the paper quotes him saying his actions were about, let me see, informing the public as to that which is done in their name and that which is done against them.
Yeah, and it notes he made significant personal sacrifices, living in exile, losing his career, facing accusations of, well, treason.
Mm. And the study does point out that public opinion, specifically in the U.S., is sharply divided on him. Is he a hero or a villain?
And it mentions polls often show Republicans being less supportive than Democrats, so definitely a figure who gets strong, very different reactions.
Okay. So the researchers decided to look at this complex figure through a very specific psychological lens. Terror management theory, or TMT.
Right.
What's the gist of TMT?
So TMT basically starts with this fundamental human awareness of death. Knowing we're going to die could potentially create like paralyzing terror.
Mm.
So the theory suggests that to manage this terror, we humans create and rely really heavily on our cultural worldviews.
Our shared beliefs, values, institutions, that kind of thing.
Exactly. All that stuff. It provides a sense of meaning, order, and crucially, a way to feel like valuable individuals in a reality that makes sense.
So living up to cultural standards helps buffer that fear of death.
Precisely. It acts like a psychological shield against that deep-seated anxiety about mortality and, insignificance.
Ah, okay. And that leads directly to the core prediction they tested in this study, the mortality salience hypothesis.
That's the one. The idea is if you make someone's mortality salient, basically, remind them they're going to die, their need to uphold and defend their cultural worldview intensifies.
Right.
And this should, in theory, lead them to show more support for people who seem to champion important cultural values.
And maybe react negatively to those who violate them.
Exactly. Both sides of the coin.
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting, connecting it to Snowden. The study, it seems, builds on earlier TMT research.
Yes. Previous work showed that mortality salience, this death reminder, can increase support for those upholding values, or even for charismatic leaders.
Like, the source mentions studies linking support for George W. Bush after 9/11 to people managing their mortality concerns.
Right. But this study wanted to take it a step further. Instead of just general support or focusing on charismatic leaders, they specifically looked at heroic perceptions.
Heroic perceptions. Okay.
Yeah, they wanted to see if thinking about death makes people more likely to see someone as a hero, fitting that specific psychological sort of prototype.
And there's research on what makes up a hero prototype, right? Qualities like bravery, honesty, selflessness.
The paper mentions bravery, moral integrity, honesty, selflessness, helpfulness. And the authors made a key assumption here.
Which was?
They assumed Edward Snowden fits this prototype, especially when you think about selflessness and bravery, given the huge personal cost of his actions.
Okay, makes sense as an assumption to test. And how do they connect him specifically to TMT and cultural values?
Their central assumption was that Snowden's actions were fundamentally motivated by fighting for the values of honesty and truth.
Values they considered important cultural values.
Yes. Core values within, a typical Western cultural worldview.
So, tying all that together, what was the specific hypothesis they tested?
They predicted that reminding people of death-making mortality salient would actually increase their heroic perceptions of Edward Snowden.
And they thought this would happen kind of across the board.
Well, they hypothesized it would happen independently of a person's patriotism or their political orientation, whether liberal or conservative.
Why?
The thinking was that the value of fighting for truth might resonate strongly enough under mortality salience to cut across those usual divides.
Fascinating setup. So how did they actually test this? What did the experiment look like?
They recruited 194 U.S. citizens online, used Amazon Mechanical Turk, which is pretty common for these types of psych studies.
Right, and participants were randomly put into one of two groups?
Yep. The experimental group got the mortality salience condition. They had to answer open-ended questions about their own death. Pretty direct stuff.
Like, what happens to you as you physically die? And what emotions does the thought of your own death arouse in you?
Exactly those kinds of questions. While the control group answered similar questions, but about something much less existential.
Visiting the dentist.
Visiting the dentist, yeah. Painful maybe, but not quite the same level of dread.
Unnecessary comparison, I guess. Then what? Did they immediately ask about Snowden?
No, and this is standard practice in TMT research. First, there was a buffer task. Participants filled out a pretty lengthy mood questionnaire, the PANIS X.
Why the buffer?
The idea is to let any immediate conscious mood effects of thinking about death dissipate. TMT predicts the effects on worldview defense are more subtle, non-conscious, and kick in after that initial potential dip in mood.
Ah, so it's not just about being in a bad mood.
Right. And the study actually confirmed that the mortality salience manipulation didn't significantly affect reported mood afterwards, which is consistent with a lot of prior TMT findings. The defenses operate deeper than just feeling sad or anxious right away.
Okay, so after the mood buffer, then they measured how people saw Snowden.
Exactly. Only then did they present the 9 items designed to measure heroic perceptions. Things like Edward Snowden is a hero. Edward Snowden tells the truth, but also items like Edward Snowden is a betrayer.
And people rated their agreement on a scale.
Yeah, 9-point scale for each statement.
And they also collected data on patriotism and political orientation, right, to see if those played a role.
Correct. They measured those alongside the Snowden perceptions.
So the moment of truth, what happened when they analyzed all that data? What were the key findings?
Well, here's the core finding, and it's pretty striking, just like they predicted. Participants who were reminded of their death reported significantly stronger heroic perceptions of Edward Snowden compared to the control group who thought about the dentist.
Wow, so thinking about death actually made people see him more as a hero.
That's what the data showed, yeah. The statistics suggested it wasn't just a random fluke. The death reminders seemed to have a real, measurable impact. P5NO23 and P5 went up 1 scene in their models, for those interested in the stats.
Okay, so the main hypothesis was supported. What else did they find? Anything about patriotism?
Yes, they did find a significant effect there, too. Heroic perceptions of Snowden decreased as participants' self-reported level of patriotism increased.
That seems maybe less surprising. Higher patriotism, less likely to see someone who leaked government secrets as a hero.
It fits a certain intuition, yeah. But it was a clear statistical relationship in their data, P.001 and P.003.
And what about political orientation, liberal versus conservative? Did that predict how people saw Snowden?
This part's interesting. Political orientation was not a significant predictor of heroic perceptions when patriotism was also included in the statistical analysis. It suggests that, at least in this study, patriotism was the stronger factor influencing views on Snowden. Political orientation only seemed to matter when patriotism wasn't accounted for.
Okay. So patriotism seemed to overshadow the liberal-conservative split in this context?
It appears so, yes.
Yeah.
And importantly, they looked for what are called interaction effects.
Right, like did thinking about death boost heroic perceptions more for liberals than conservatives? Or less for highly patriotic people?
Exactly. They checked if the mortality salience effect depended on patriotism or political orientation.
Yeah.
And the answer was no. They found no significant interactions. All interaction, 0.147.
So the boost in seeing Snowden as a hero after thinking about death, it happened pretty much the same way, regardless of how patriotic someone was or where they fell politically.
That's what the results indicated. The effect wasn't dependent on those other factors. It seemed more fundamental, in a way.
Okay, let's try to pull these threads together. What's the study's interpretation? What do the authors think this all means?
Well, according to the authors, the main finding that mortality salience increases heroic perceptions of Snowden strongly supports their hypothesis.
Right.
They interpret this through that TMT lens we discussed, because Snowden's actions are assumed, in their framework, to uphold cultural values like honesty and truth.
Reminding people of death intensifies their need to support figures who champion those values.
Precisely. It makes those values feel more important, and thus Snowden, as a perceived champion of them, seems more heroic.
And they see this as adding something new to TMT research.
Yeah, they argue it provides evidence that MS increases the need for heroes, specifically people fitting that prototype of bravery, selflessness, not just general support for values or the kind of charismatic leaders studied before.
So Snowden, in this context, might be perceived less as just a leader and more as this specific hero type, and the death reminder boosts that perception.
That seems to be their interpretation, yes.
What about the patriotism finding? Higher patriotism linked to lower heroic perceptions. How do they explain that?
The study mainly just reports it as a clear finding. They don't speculate too deeply on the why in the paper itself.
But one could guess, maybe for more patriotic individuals, values like loyalty to the country or its institutions might become more dominant, potentially overshadowing the truth-telling aspect Snowden represents for others.
That's a plausible interpretation, though the study itself doesn't explicitly draw that conclusion. It just notes the correlation.
And the lack of interaction. The fact that the death reminder effect wasn't really changed by patriotism or politics.
The authors suggest this supports their initial idea that fighting for truth is a cultural value that can resonate quite broadly, potentially cutting across these typical political or patriotic divides, especially when mortality is made salient.
So facing our own mortality might make the abstract value of truth so important that it elevates someone seen as fighting for it, regardless of your usual political tribe or level of national pride.
That seems to be the argument they're making based on these findings. They even connect it to the real world, suggesting that major existential threats, like the 9/11 attacks they mentioned earlier,
Right.
could potentially function similarly, increasing heroic perceptions of individuals who are seen as upholding key cultural values during that crisis.
It's a really powerful idea, suggesting our most fundamental fear can subconsciously shift our views on these really controversial public figures. But like any study, there are caveats, right? Did the authors themselves raise any?
Oh, absolutely. They were careful to point out limitations and unanswered questions in their discussions.
Such as?
Well, for one, their whole interpretation kind of hinges on the assumption that Snowden's actions are primarily seen through the lens of honesty and truth.
But what if other values were made more prominent?
Exactly. They speculate, what if this study had somehow highlighted values like loyalty to an employer, or emphasized the potential national security risks from the leaks?
If those values were front and center when people were reminded of death.
Then, the authors suggest, mortality salience might actually lead to a devaluation of Snowden. The effect could completely flip depending on which cultural value framework gets activated by the death reminder.
So it's not automatic. It depends on which values feel most relevant or threatened.
Precisely. Another big question they raise is about group membership.
Like whether participants saw Snowden as one of us.
Yeah. The study didn't assess if people viewed Snowden as an in-group member, a fellow U.S. citizen acting for the benefit of other citizens, or as an out-group member, maybe someone acting against national interests.
And they wonder if seeing the person as part of your group is necessary for this effect.
They raise it as a possibility. Is perceived in-group status a prerequisite for mortality salience to boost heroic perceptions of someone controversial like Snowden?
Yeah.
It's an open question.
Okay, what else?
They also acknowledge the nature of their sample recruiting people online through Amazon Mechanical Turk. They speculate, this is just speculation, that maybe people on those platforms are potentially more sensitive to issues around data security and surveillance, which could have influenced the results. Maybe the effect wouldn't be as strong in a different population sample.
That's fair to consider. Any other nuances?
Yeah, one more interesting point they bring up relates to social comparison.
How so?
They wonder if, under certain conditions, thinking about death might actually decrease heroic perceptions.
How would that work?
Well, imagine you're reminded of your mortality, and then you're presented with this incredibly brave, selfless hero. If comparing yourself to that hero makes you feel inadequate about your own life, your own contributions, especially when you're grappling with existential anxiety.
It could actually feel threatening to your self-esteem.
Exactly. And that feeling of inadequacy might lead you to unconsciously devalue the hero as a way to protect your own sense of self-worth. So the effect could even go the other way sometimes.
Wow, okay. That adds yet another layer of complexity to it all.
It certainly does. Human psychology is rarely simple.
All right, let's try to synthesize this. The core, really surprising finding from this deep dive seems to be that this fundamental psychological trigger, just thinking about our own mortality, appears to make people significantly more likely to see someone like Edward Snowden as a hero.
Yes, and the study interprets this using terror management theory. The idea is that facing death makes us cling harder to important cultural values, like truth and honesty,
And in this framework, Snowden's actions were perceived as championing those specific values.
making him seem more heroic when those values feel particularly vital.
And this boost in heroic perception seemed to happen regardless of general political leanings, liberal or conservative.
Right, but it was related to patriotism. Higher patriotism generally meant lower heroic perceptions of Snowden, although the death reminder still had its boosting effect across different patriotism levels.
Okay, so the mortality salience effect itself seemed to operate somewhat independently of those factors in the study.
That's what the data suggested.
So here's a final thought for you, the listener, to maybe ponder, building directly on the study's insights. If reminders of our own mortality can shift our perception of who counts as a hero based on which cultural values suddenly feel more important, what other values might rise or fall in importance for you personally when you're confronted with existential concerns?
And thinking bigger, how might different real-world crises or threats, things like a pandemic or climate change or even intense political instability, how might those activate different sets of values in society?
And consequently, maybe alter how we collectively view controversial figures or leaders or actions happening all around us. What really stands out to you from this deep dive?